Hey there, in this video I'll be showcasing my latest build. This is a spin on the very popular Totem Explode build that has been ramping in popularity primarily with the Pathfinder ascendancy. I'll put a disclaimer up front, this is not a solo play build, this is a build designed around having an Aurabot duo and utterly destroys everything because of it. I'll also note that we stopped min-maxing damage in this build after a while since it was completely unnecessary and we were saving up. So there are plenty of things you can change in this build that I'll be showing to get even more damage with it if you so desire. And to open my character panel here, you can see that my defensives are basically 0 without the Aurabot. This build is entirely made to sell carries for Uber bosses. For reference, this build is capable of basically instantly one-shotting the final phase of Uber Sirus with 6 people in the instance. Let's talk about the gear you need and or want on this build. I'll preface this section with that we deal primarily cold converted physical damage and have effectively 0% crit, and we don't even attempt to scale that. Weapons. The weapons that we'll be working with are 2 Void Scepters that are Redeemer influenced. The most important thing about these scepters, obviously, is that they have the Totem Explode node on them at 300%. This is the highest tier for a one-handed weapon. And the other thing to note is that it is a Redeemer influenced scepter. And when we look at these, you can see that it has one important mod that everything else is relatively unimportant. That is T1 physical damage is extra cold damage. Both of these have the exact same thing. And then basically I just crafted on the percent increased cold damage. It is worse than if you actually rolled cold damage on the scepter itself, but it's also incredibly hard to get both of these mods at the same time. So I opted to just focus on the more annoying mod to get, more important mod, which is extra fizz as cold, and then just craft on the percent cold afterwards. It is worth noting that the other nodes on the Crucible tree for these weapons are relatively inconsequential and only provide minor quality of life. Feel free to ignore them and focus primarily on getting the Totem Explode node on column 3 or 4 when crafting. If you do want to craft a full weapon, the nodes that are of relatively good power are in column 1. You can see one of them is this one here with a percent increased maximum energy shield. The other ones, which I do not currently have on either of my weapons, are the percent chance to freeze, which I believe comes with flat added cold that does nothing. Flat percent chance to shock. We get a little bit of lightning damage from our specters, so we can shock through that manner. The node that we have here, the percent ES, and then there's also one that is a percent convert to cold. This will be particularly useful in a little bit more of a min-maxy version of the build, where you drop the Uber Sirus that I'm currently wearing, and focus on getting a full cold convert from masteries and modifiers on the glove. In the second column, I do not currently have a good second column because these are relatively inconsequential. There's not many good ones here. If you are really trying for it, I recommend going for Zealot's Oath. That way you can save a point on the tree. Other ones that are of relatively okay value is Runebinder. If you're using multiple totems, you don't actually want to reduce your totem limit to 0. If you're not running multi-totem, that's actually a bad thing. Divine Shield is also pretty good because we don't really have access to it. We do have a ton of armor, so if you do get hit, you generate a good amount of armor. Although most bosses don't necessarily do physical damage, so it's not a crazy benefit, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. And I believe there's also a node on the second row that regenerates percent mana. look for the one that has no downside or the downside that is irrelevant to this build. I believe there's one that has like reduced cast speed, and that is perfectly okay for this build because we do not scale with cast speed, and trap throwing speed does not slow down with lower cast speed. Now we're going to look at other pieces of the gear. First thing up is a Heatshiver. We go this because we take % chance to freeze on our tree, and if we freeze a boss, and oh boy, do we freeze bosses, you will get basically 100% extra damage because all of our damage is cold damage, and Heatshiver basically duplicates that damage as fire damage. Now, you may be wondering if we actually do freeze bosses, and if we go into POB, I can quickly showcase our freeze threshold, which in calcs, we go to, I'm currently using lightning tendrils to simulate the damage with a few mods in the configuration to bring it more accurate up to the actual damage that it might deal. If we look in the non-damaging ailment section, we can see in this section here that their target must have no more than 4.7 billion ailment threshold. Now, Uber bosses generally have a freeze threshold of 5% of their max life. And I can relatively safely say that we far surpass that number, and basically every boss will get frozen and you will get the full benefit of Heatshiver on it. I have not noticed a case where my Heatshiver has not been activating and giving me the full value. So this is a relatively safe get, especially with how much damage our Totem Explodes do. For the Amulet, basically any amulet with +1 all skill gems works. We're basically only caring about the +1 skill gems because it amplifies the level of our main totem skill, which gives us more health on the totem, which in consequence gives us more damage. That is basically the only thing we care about is the totem health. Other good mods that you can get on an amulet are ES and % ES, which you can see here. I have 31 flat ES and 21% increased ES. If you can, I recommend crafting flat endurance or flat min endurance charges or min frenzy charges if you're looking for a more damage oriented craft. And the ideal anoint is Ironwood unless you're using an impossible escape on iron reflexes down here, because this is the only way for us to get Ironwood. You can opt to do a impossible escape with iron reflexes down here to get all 4 of these nodes, including Ironwood, in which case you can anoint something else. But the cost of an iron reflex impossible escape is relatively high for a somewhat minimal value, because you have to consider that you can already anoint Ironwood. There isn't a really amazing good anoint otherwise, and you are also giving up a jewel that can roll totem life on it. Like this one here, you can see this 8% total life, it goes up to 12, and you're giving up this totem life modifier to get the impossible escape to then spend the points getting these totem life modifiers. So it's a min-maxy thing, you can get it like that, but otherwise, for your neck, primarily just look for the +1 skill gems. It is basically the only thing you need. ES is probably the second most important thing for defensive layers. And then other than that, look for an open suffix if you don't need to craft ES on it for crafting a min charge. Next, we're going to look at the rings. These are 2 Circle of Guilts with buff effect and % increased physical damage. You can use Catalyst to boost the physical damage modifier, the % increased physical damage modifier. This does not work on the buff effect, but it is still a damage increase worth doing for the physical damage modifier. We have a lot of Herald of Purity ramping in this build, and it provides a lot of physical damage multiplier. If we look at Herald of Purity, you can see that it provides % more physical damage. Because the Totem Explode is a base physical damage hit, Herald of Purity directly scales it, and these % increased buff effects basically together add up to doubling this 13%. So just the buff effect alone provide about 13% damage on their own. And then we have additional sources of Herald buffing using these Herald nodes here as well, which further buff Herald of Purity. Next, we're going to go into the chest, which, as you can see, is a Diala's Malefaction. This item gives your totem an absolutely ludicrous amount of health. You can get up to a +12. I currently have a +10, but you can get up to a +12 with a really min-maxed Diala's for rejuvenating totems specifically. Devouring totems a little bit different. But in this case, my +10 comes from +1 in the neck, +2 from Diala's by placing this in a red socket, which you can see gives gems in a red socket give +2 to level. I have +5 from Empower, which is also in a red socket, so it's a level 6 Empower, which gives an effective +5 levels to the skill gem. And then the Corrupted Implicit of this Diala is a +2 level of Aura Gems, which you can see works with Rejuvenation Totem because it has an Aura tag. You can get up to a +12 if this Diala had 2 of the following: +2 Aura, +2 AoE, or +1 All. This is an incredibly expensive thing to find, as +1 All in general is incredibly expensive due to how it works with Devouring Totem. So getting a +2 Aura or +2 AoE is cheaper and also works just as fine. Now moving into the gloves, you can see that hilariously I'm still just using a basic Hrim Sirus. Now Hrim Sirus are an incredible item because it provides a full conversion to cold damage for free. We don't have to invest in the Cold Master, you don't have to invest in getting a fully well-rolled high-level Eldritch Implicits to get the cold conversion, or we don't have to worry about wasting a mod on our Watcher's Eye to get cold conversion while affected by hatred. You can basically just get it all for free from this, extremely cheap. The main thing that you're going to want to get on this is basically just Elemental Weakness on hit, Corrupted Implicit. This is just the easiest way to apply a curse in this build. You can optionally get curse implicits on Circles of Guilt, but they are ludicrously expensive, especially compared to Hrim Sirus. I highly recommend just getting on Hrim Sirus. It's very cheap. This item is super good for this build, despite how cheap it is. Moving into the boots, you can see that I'm using a rare here that's a little bit crafted. However, if you want to run a unique, you can run Torshuak, which provides good DPS with its up to 30% totem life modifier. Or you can also run Deerstalkers, which has good quality of life because it provides a large amount of trap throwing speed. Both of those are very valid, unique alternatives. I chose to recraft my boots due to the extra Fizz's Cold Eldritch Implicit, which I attached to Pinnacle bosses only because this build basically only does Pinnacle bosses. It's worth noting that these boots are still less damage compared to Torshuak's because Totem Life is an incredibly powerful modifier. But the other reason was that it was really easy to get a high modifier to ES on these boots. I believe this thing with my Aurabot gave me about 500 to 600 ES, and it also allowed me to get the Outer Suppulsion for Chaos Golems, which you can see 63% of increased effect, a buff granted by Chaos Golems. We'll talk about this later, but this provides, I believe, about 3% flat Fizz reduction as well, which is incredibly good for survivability against Fizz hits. Now for belt, I chose to craft a crystal belt, and you can see that this belt is basically has two things: a ton of energy shield and flask effect modifiers. Now, all of these flask effect modifiers effectively only matter for one thing, and that is my mana flask. This build has a whole lot of mana problems, which we'll talk about later, and having the flask mana recovery rate as well as the duration of the flask being longer allows for this issue to be solved a lot. As you can see, just a sneak peek at my flask, you can see that it is an Enduring Flask with T1 reduced mana cost of skills. This is extremely important, and we will talk about it later. But this belt basically just gives me a ton of defensiveness and amplifies that flask to help solve some of my mana problems. Now we're going to talk about the flask. We just talked about the Enduring Mana Flask and how it's extremely useful. As we can see, if we watch my mana without, please note this is without the Aurabot, so it has clarity, which it also has a ton. You can see that I can basically only throw about 4 or 5 traps before I go completely out of mana. However, if I use the Enduring Flask, you see that it has quite a long duration. If I start throwing traps now, you can see I can throw a whole ton more flasks before running out of mana. Of course, I still out of mana because I don't have the clarity from the Aurabot, but you can see how much impact that this Enduring Mana Flask has. Now, moving into other flasks, because we are a very upfront, bursty build, the only things we really care about are having a burst window, which is why you can see that I have a bunch of unique flasks, and they are all rolled for percent increase effect using Kindling Orb. Kindling Orbs, which are primarily used for Mageblood builds on magic utility flasks, can be used here to amplify the effects of these unique flasks. For example, this will amplify the extra elemental as chaos damage sort of thing, the extra fizz as cold, the percent increased damage taken by enemies on the consecrated ground, and the Ele pen for which your elemental resistance is the highest part. All of those together, and you also note that these are just damage flasks. This is because arguably most fights only have 1 or 2 windows where you really need to just nuke the boss. For Sirus, that's the last phase. For Maven, that's also the last phase. Exarch and Eater, that's just from the get-go of the start of the fight. And Uber Elder and Uber Elder and Shaper don't really have one, but you could arguably consider that nuking them down to get them through phases quicker is very valuable. And both of those fights also have a lot of flask regens. You can actually nuke them in most phases. Moving into jewels, we run 2 large cluster jewels. As you can see here, these cluster jewels are relatively inconsequential. These nodes don't do a ton. They're like moderate amounts of damage, a little bit of defensiveness on the evasion rating and armor. But the primary thing is that it gives you access to 2 more jewel slots. Now this is really important because we use a lot of jewels and are very jewel starved, as well as just being an easy way to get damage while also getting jewel sockets, as compared to wasting like 3 points to get a jewel socket with no damage on the way. As for the other things that this jewel uses, we use a lot of unique jewels. You may have saw it when I hovered over it, but over here you can see we use a Forbidden Flesh and Flame. We are currently allocating Polymath, which due to the sheer number of unique masteries we have, this gives, I believe when I checked last, 27% more damage multiplier. We have 9 unique masteries allocated. An alternative to this, if you're looking for something more budget, because I believe Polymath is one of the more expensive Shadow ones, is the Uber-only node for Shadow. I believe it's called Harness the Void. When I was looking at Forbidden Flesh and Flames, that one was much cheaper, and it provides a similar damage boost. It's like maybe 8% damage less, because it just provides flat chance to do extra chaos damage with all of your damage. It's still pretty good, it's just not as good as Polymath. And Polymath is the end game. Harness the Void is pretty good. I recommend getting at least one of these. They are huge damage boosts. For other jewels that we run in the build for uniques, I have a Watcher's Eye. It's worth remembering that only generic damage mods will apply to the Totem Explode. Anything that is spell damage or X to spells, like the flat damage to spells on the Hatred mod, do not apply. So as you can see here, I have just generic raw cold damage, and I have an ES recovery rate just to have a somewhat useful second mod. You can kind of put whatever. There's not a ton of good mods on Watcher's Eyes. There's some good defensive ones, and for offensive, I found that the flat cold damage, like the one you see here, as well as the Hatred flat pen, are some of the better mods that I've noted so far. If you're trying not to run a Crimsorrow, then the Cold Convert Hatred mod is also good on this Watcher's Eye. The other remaining 2 unique jewels we run is an Impossible Escape with an Elegant Hubris. You can see that I'm doing something kind of weird down here. This is an interesting setup that I found on Reddit about a week and a half ago from this point, where you can use a Impossible Escape to gain access to a lot of notables that surround an Elegant Hubris placed in the center. Now, there's a lot of valid Elegant Hubrises that you can put here. I recommend using POB's Jewel tool, which, oops, sorry. Let me bring that back up for you. There's a Timeless Jewel tool at the bottom of the tree on POB, and it basically lets you select a jewel socket, and then if you filter node, you can basically, what I would recommend doing is going into POB, selecting the jewel socket, manually clicking all of these things, allocating them. You won't obviously have the points, so that's fine. And then you'll want to click the filter nodes button, and then you want to generate, and then it'll basically show you what nodes you want. So for example, this one that I have here provides 3 or 2, I believe it was 2 fizz damage. Sorry, this was the super defensive one that I ended up getting, where it's 1% fizz damage, 2 80% armors, and an 80% evasion rating. There are some good ones that are 3 fizz damage and an armor that I decided not to bother with, because again, this build does ludicrous damage. You don't actually need to crank it super hard, as long as you have an Aurabot that knows how to crank his Hatred Aura. So I chose to opt for a little bit more defensiveness. These give a ton of armor. As you can see, there's 160% increased armor. We don't have a lot of increased armor modifiers in this build, so these give a ton of armor, especially with all the flat armor that Aurabots give.
And this is an extremely high value setup between the possible escape and the elegant hubris, whether it's for damage with more 80% fizz mods or defensiveness with the 80% armor and evasion mods. One last quick note on jewels. When looking at rare jewels, which we have a few of, there's not a ton of them in this build, but you have a few slots for them. Mods that you want to be looking for are percent increased totem life. This is the strongest mod for damage purposes. Percent increased energy shield. This is one of the strongest mods for defensive purposes. Percent reduced mana cost of skills, because as we saw before, mana is a little bit of a problem. This is one of the most quality of life mods you can get on a jewel. And then obviously you can try to solve like stat problems or res problems if you're like just under the cap, which you realistically shouldn't be if your Aurabot is running purities and purity of elements. But if he's not, then you might want to get aura or get elemental resistances on these as well. Another good mod that you can get, which I don't believe I have on any of mine anymore, is percent area damage, which does work on Totem Explode. Otherwise, you also will probably want to get a Corrupted Blood Jewel if you plan to do Sirus at all. Due to Sirus' abilities, applying Corrupted Blood, which can stop your regen and kill you if you're not careful. Now, I wanted to make a quick note on mana issues. This build suffers quite a bit from mana consumption, which happens because, unlike the normal variants of this build that run without an Aurabot, we don't actually want to run Eldritch Battery because it kind of nerfs how much effective health an Aurabot can give you. It also means we have to invest even more into survivability than we would want to. The mana issues that happen in this build I solve with a few things. The first one, which we can't showcase right here, is the Aurabot runs a max level clarity and a generosity setup. They don't need the effect of the mana regen, and we don't really have many offensive auras in this build. I believe the only offensive aura that the Aurabot actually runs is Hatred. So we can afford to put the clarity alongside Hatred in the generosity setup. You can also roll, as we saw earlier, the reduced mana cost of skills on rare jewels. Like this jewel here, you can see it can roll up to 5%, go down to 3%. 5% is way better than 3, almost double the amount of reduced mana cost, so try to find 5s if you can. It's not a huge deal if you can't. I only have one of these jewels. The most important thing for mana problems is the Flask I also showed earlier. Basically, this is 29% reduced cost skills, and this is basically mandatory to be paired with Enduring so that you can have the reduced mana cost skills during the entire effect of the Flask. So basically, it won't like cap, like you won't start and then you use the Flask and cap your mana. Basically, you have the reduced mana cost the entire time you're throwing. You don't have to worry about it capping and going away and that sort of thing. The other thing is that there's actually an interesting node here called Insightfulness, which actually grants you 10% reduced mana cost of skills while on full ES. And because we're a very bursty skill, we actually do a lot of damage with our setup before the bosses are even attackable. We are pretty much always on full ES during those ramps. So you are effectively always benefiting from this unless you don't kill the boss or you miss or something like that. You have to fight the boss in the middle. Maybe you'll get hit, maybe you won't get this benefit, but for most of the time, this is basically just 10% reduced mana cost of skills at all points. Another thing worth noting is that because we don't have crit, we have to find sources of chance to freeze in order for Heatshiver to actually give its benefit. This is most simply obtained with a few nodes on the passive tree, which for me, I'm currently taking the nodes leading up to Breath of Rime, which are these two nodes which provide 10 and 15% chance to freeze respectively, and also run these nodes leading to Winter's Embrace, which provide 15% each for a total of 30. Now, when going for Winter's Embrace, you basically don't have to take the Winter's Embrace node because all you really care about is the freeze, which is why I went for Breath of Rime, because it gives a percent increased hull damage, which gives you damage along with the nodes leading up to it. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the passive tree that I use. Worth noting that not many things actually scale our damage, as I've mentioned a few times now. Mods need to be explicitly generic damage in order to apply. Things like spell damage adds damage to spells, attack damage adds damage to attacks. Do not actually do anything to the spell damage or to the damage of the explosion. This means mods like percent increased spell damage will not work, but mods like percent increase cold damage will. Since we're unable to benefit from a lot of the nodes, a lot of our tree focuses on what damage nodes we do benefit from, alongside a lot of defensive and quality of life nodes. Now we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the tree so we can go over each major notable I take, each mastery, and what the benefits are. Now, we start off by going through the ES nodes here. I choose to do this over going here because these are one of the easier ways to access percent increased ES, as well as giving evasion, which boosts our evasion from the grace from our Aurabot. We move along over to here, we move up to these trap nodes, which is basically just taken for trap throwing speed. Trap trigger area of effect is also relatively useful if the boss is moving around or teleporting. You may not get the exact location of where they went correct. It has a higher chance of proccing and activating. And the mastery we take here can have up to 5 additional traps placed at a time. This is incredibly useful for bosses that have very blatant windups, and you can like place a ton of traps down on where they're going to spawn, and it increases your upfront burst even more from doing this. For example, Exarch and Eater, the very start of the fight. Maven at the start of the fight, and if you can read her movements at the end of each mission, are all cases where you can predict where they're going to spawn and throw a ton of traps on it and just absolutely nuke them as they spawn. Then we go over here, moving towards this area, we can see that I path through here. These are just relatively good nodes. They give evasion rating ES. This mastery gives a large amount of evasion rating because we have a ton of int in this build. If we take a look at the side, we can see that I have 35,000 evasion rating. And if I take away this node, it goes down to 27,000. So this node alone gives 7,000 evasion rating. Moving over here, I take Ghost Dance because it's just a no-brainer for someone who is an ES build with a lot of evasion. This is just a great defensive layer. Moving up into here, I also take these nodes for chance for trap to trigger an additional time with the mastery that does the exact same thing. This basically gives your traps an 18% chance to activate without consuming the trap, which basically gives you 18% more damage in a sense, unless you're able to throw 30 plus traps in the time it takes for that trap to reactivate, which isn't realistic. So basically this is just 18% more damage, and even adds even more to your burst if you get a bunch of traps that don't trigger. The relatively good node, it's worth getting. These trap damage nodes don't do anything, but these two nodes are quite good. There's not a ton of points to put in this build anyway. Now we move back, and we're gonna go back up the tree. Leaf Shade, incredibly good for bossing. Makes it basically impossible to die. Shaper Beam, Sirus Storms, Sirus Degen, those sort of things. Shaper Degens, like Leaf Shade is incredibly good for bossing. I highly recommend it. I will note that you should definitely make sure you have ailment immunity on between either you or your Aurabot, and corrupted blood immunity. Otherwise, although this doesn't necessarily apply to corrupted blood, so it's primarily for the purity of elements, I recommend making sure you have ailment immunity somehow. Otherwise, things like Sirus might just completely destroy you, because Sirus is known for applying a bunch of ailments if you do get hit with an attack. Moving up a bit more, we take these nodes for the life, NES, the survivability nodes. This is just a decent node if you're getting hit with a big hit right at the start of your ES. If you want to move this point elsewhere, you don't have this point is very easy to take and move elsewhere. Same thing with this cluster. If you're lacking in points, these 5 points here can easily be taken and reallocated elsewhere. These nodes are just really effective because we do cold damage, and then Heatshiver also does fire damage. So this works for basically all of our damage types. The Elemental Mastery here, which inflicts or makes our exposure always inflict a minus 18%, synergizes with a cold mastery that we also take, which makes our cold damage, which is the primary damage of our totems, inflict cold exposure at a 10% chance whenever we hit. These two together basically get us a free 18% exposure on things when our traps start chain proccing. Now, if we go over here, we're not going to discuss down here because we talked about this earlier. This is the Elegant Hubris with the possible escape on solipsism, however you say that. And then each of these nodes give a bunch of defensiveness and so on. So then we move up. We obviously take Chaos Inoculation because we're going pure ES, and we don't run Chevrons, so we have to take Chaos Inoculation to deal with the Chaos damage.
Cluster Jewel with the jewels that we talked about before. Moving over, we take the Int Cluster just because it gives a ton of Int, and Int scales your energy shield. It's just a defensive layer here. We move over here, we take the Breath of Rhyme nodes for the freeze chance. You can also go down here and take these freeze chances as well. We go up to Heart of Ice because these are all percent cold, which all affect our damage. We also have the Cold Pen, which is also incredibly valuable because we don't have a ton of resistance penetration in this build. Next is the Herald area. Basically, we take these to buff the Herald of Purity. You can see how much damage this can give, as well as taking 8%. Honestly, looking at this might be a mistake because I think I take this, but I took it for my Aurabot Aura, so I actually probably don't recommend this. This is actually a mistake. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. Over here, we have Watcher's Eye. Going over here, we have the entire ES cluster just for defensiveness. We go up here, Cluster Jewel. We go down here, we have more defensive nodes over here in the ES. We go over here, we take Zealot's Oath because the Aurabot runs Vitality and we are purely ES based, so this is a huge amount of defensive layer. You can see that we gain over 1,000 ES regen from this. This also combines a little bit with our Rejuve totems providing their own life regen as well. We come down here, we take these nodes because they provide ES as well. These are relatively minor. These 2 points give on average 6% ES per node. Just keep that in mind if you want to reallocate them. We take these nodes because they give physical, or they give totem life, more totem life. And then the mastery, I take the chance to summon 2 totems. If you don't have the Crucible nodes to try and get the pseudo multi-totems without actually having multi-totems, I would recommend taking the 5% damage of hits taken from a nearby totem's life instead of you. It's just a defensive layer. Even though our totems are constantly exploding, there's always usually 1 totem alive at any given time during a fight. You can take that. Always make sure you have something here, even if you consider it useless, because the Totem Mastery gives you damage from Polymath for 3%, and that's the only Totem Mastery we have. Going down here for the final nodes of the tree, we just have Armor, ES, Armor, ES, Armor, ES, and we have another unique mastery. This one, if I remember correctly, was not supposed to be that, it's supposed to be this. The POV was a little bit messed up. But this basically just gives you 10% free physical damage mitigation because we are CI and we can't take chaos damage. And that about covers the entirety of the... Oh, this is post-edit me, realizing that this is actually fine because we gained the benefit from this from the 2 heralds that we have. This was not a mistake. You should take this node. It is perfectly fine. Now let's talk about gem links. If you look at this, it's a little bit chaotic. So we're going to move back into the game to show off gem links for now, for the gems that I personally use. We're going to start with the Spectre setup. What I have here is Minion Life, Ray Spectre, Meat Shield. The reason I run this is because you can see these little guys running around me with their little auras. These are Baronite Clerics. They spawn pretty much everywhere in Baron influence maps. If you go Baron Conqueror map, this is where you get these Spectres. These mobs apply a buff to you if you are within their aura, which gives you 20% extra fizz as lightning, I believe is the number, while you stand within it, and as long as you're running Meat Shields, which would be here, these guys pretty much hug you all the time, and you'll pretty much always be getting this as long as you're not actively moving around, where they can sometimes, apparently not this time, there we go, if you flame dash in front of them, for example, you can sometimes leave their aura range, but otherwise, they're pretty hard to lose as long as you're just kind of walking around. So these guys give a pretty good damage. And then we have the 2 heralds. We have Herald of Purity and Herald of Ash. These are basically just free damage. We don't really run auras on our side of things because the Aurabot can pretty much cover everything on their own. And we also need our own mana since we can't run Eldritch Battery for our incredibly high cost trap setup. Herald of Purity in particular is very big DPS increase due to its more fizz damage multiplier, which we scale in multiple places like the Circle of Purity rings, as well as the Herald nodes that we already showed before. And moving into the Chaos Golem, this Chaos Golem is basically just for defensiveness. If you run this, you will want to get it to level 22 somehow. The easiest way to do this is to buy level 21
and then just combine it with your +1 level of all skill gems necklace, and that'll boost it to level 22. This gives you a breakpoint in the percent fizz reduction. You can see that it's that is 5% right now. And if I take it out, put it on my inventory at level 21, is a 4% additional physical damage reduction. And then you can further enhance this by getting an anomalous summon Chaos Golem, which gives a 20, as you can see, 20% increased buff effect, which works well with here, and it gives us +1% fizz damage reduction from just that, from just the quality on this. You can also further amplify this with the Eldritch implicits on boots. This gives an additional 63% increased effect of the buff, which is effectively 3% more fizz reduction. And you can also, there is also a helmet enchant, I believe, for Herald of Purity, which I don't currently have, but it also grants more, sorry, not Herald of Purity, for Chaos Golem, which also grants more effect of it. If you can find this on a Heatshiver, it's also a pretty good one. There's not many good helmet enchants, because neither Devouring Totem or Rejuvenating Totem have like Totem Life enchants from lab. So you're basically between the Chaos Golem effect or whatever golem you're using, doesn't have to be Chaos Golem, or a Purity mana reservation or Ash mana reservation enchant. And then moving into, I have a cast damage tank and Molten Shell setup. This is basically just a bunch of survivability because we have a ton of armor from the Aurabot. They run a determination which gives you a ton of flat armor and % more armor, which we then also scale with these nodes down here, as well as the any percent increased armor that you get from your Elegant Hubris of choice. So the Molten Shell, even though it's been nerfed this league, still gives a ton of defensive value, and I do recommend it as long as you have an Aurabot who's running determination. Now we talk about the important part, which is the main link. So the main link, I personally find Rejuvenating Totem, here you can find, I find Rejuvenating to be a much more budget-friendly alternative. The more popular Devouring Totem setup. With investment, like Ashes, a Dialos with +1 all gems, Devouring Totem becomes much better. If you want to, you can invest in all that. We didn't, because we could already basically obliterate any kind of Uber boss with any number of people in the instance. We didn't really feel like we needed to invest all of that money just to get extra damage that we didn't need. For Rejuvenating Totem, your link will actually look like this, with Cluster Traps, Multi-Traps, Empower, Charge Traps, Trap Support. You may ask, what about Multi-Totem support? Well, you can actually get a pseudo Multi-Totem setup via the Crucible Trees, which you can see here. The My Scepters also have this node, which is 40% chance to summon 2 totems instead. This can be gotten on both scepters, and then when combined with the Totem Mastery here, which is a 30% chance to summon 2 totems, all of these combine additively to guarantee 2 totems when a totem is spawned. Now, this doesn't stack with multi-totems. I've tried. It does not give you 3 totems if you have all of them, unfortunately. So basically, if you get this setup, there's no reason for you to have multi-totems in your setup. But if you don't have this, I would recommend stocking it in place of Charge Traps. And if we're being realistic here, Charge Traps basically never does anything with how much damage we deal. I basically only ever get 1 charge at a time because the boss just instantly dies to the initial burst of the traps most of the time. The exceptions are like Exarch and Eater, which maybe you might get some extra charges, but realistically, I wouldn't recommend wasting your time trying to craft a weapon with the multi-totem setup and then doing the Totem Mastery. You can if you want. Honestly, I would just recommend keeping multi-totems and not bothering with charge totems, but that's up to you. Now, if we use Devouring Totems, I'm going to switch back to POB because I don't have this set up myself. If you are using a Devouring Totem, your link will look probably something like this. I actually personally don't recommend using Devouring Totem unless you can do the pseudo multi-totem setup I just talked about. This is so that you can run both an Empower and an Enhance without losing the multi-totem effect. Otherwise, you'll have to drop one of these two, likely
the Enhance, I believe. I'm not exactly sure which one is stronger with Devouring Totem because the quality directly scales totem life, but so does level. It's kind of a numeric battle, which one gives more life to the totem. But basically, you'd have to drop one of these two because you cannot drop Trap, Cluster Trap, or Multi-Trap. That is an even bigger damage loss. You'd have to drop one of these very powerful nodes, and if you have to do that, you might as well just run Rejuvenating Totem anyway, where you don't need the Enhance. When using this, you would need to run it, if you're in a Diala's, you would need to run it in a +1 all gems Diala, because +2 aura and +2 AoE don't apply to Devouring Totems, because Devouring Totem does not have those tags. It is only a totem and spell tag. You can also alternatively put this in a bow with +1 all and a crafted +2 support that also gives it a relatively high number of gem levels as a more budget option to the +1 all Diala Corrupted Implicit, which is extremely expensive at the time of creating this video. I don't recommend trying to find one of these. And if you really have a ton of money with Rejuvenating Totem, you can have a Dialas like this that is +1 gems and +2 aura, or +2 aura, +2 AoE. Those sorts of things gives up to 12 gem levels on Rejuvenating Totem, and might even beat the theoretical max of Devouring Totem, although I don't have access to this, and I probably never will, so I haven't tried looking at it. That sort of thing. Now, there is one interesting variant of build that I saw on Reddit for someone also doing a cold convert, but they scaled crit, was that they used Brittle to get a base crit value, which they could then scale with the tree and that sort of thing, and effect of non-damaging ailments. One way to get that is Sublime Vision. I'm unsure, because I don't have access to it, if this would... It mentions that aura skills other than Hatred are disabled. I don't know if this would prevent other non-Hatred auras from an Aurabot from unaffecting you. This is something that I'm not aware of, but if it does work with an Aurabot, and this doesn't apply to other people's auras, then this is a good way to get Brittle for the crit variant of the build if you want to do that. I don't have any experience with the crit variant of the build because I just didn't bother investing in it, because it takes a little bit of reworking, and the build didn't really feel like it needed it. If you're planning on doing cold solo, Brittle is probably a pretty good investment, because it's a way easier way to apply freeze, guaranteed freeze, and also get a good more damage multiplier and that sort of thing. Now, I also briefly wanted to touch Aurabot side of things, so I've imported my duo partner's Aurabot here. You can see there's a bunch of different things they do. They have a bunch of voices setups with RMR. There is a way to get this Aurabot set up without RMR, because there is actually a pretty low number of... There's a very low number of auras that you actually need to run, so it's actually possible to get online without a ton of investment like this, although these things aren't necessarily super expensive. Like, these are 5 passive voices, which are relatively cheap. 3 passive voices and higher really start getting incredibly expensive. But you can just see there's a pretty generic looking Aurabot tree with voices for RMR. And in terms of auras that they provide to me as the duo carry, as you can see in the helmet, which has no increased levels, they just provide grace with an enlightened tied to purity of elements and determination. If you're looking for a way to get this with less RMR, you can take purity of elements off of the Aurabot and potentially put it on the duobot carry, dropping something like Carol of Ash, and then working with a little bit less mana, which should be fine. But if you're looking, that's one way to optimize it, to have less RMR needed to make this work. In the gloves, which are these here, which have +2 level of AoE gems, socketed AoE gems. We have all of the purities, which all have AoE tags, so they go up to level 23 for their breakpoints. They're level 21s with +2s, and then Enlighten to get more mana back. You can also reduce the RMR required by having level 4 Enlightens. We actually only use level 3s instead of investing level 4s, because those are crazy expensive. If we go into the body armor, we have basically assorted things. There's nothing like crazy in here that you need to care about in terms of the links that are actually here. Temporal Rift is an interesting niche thing that we use for Sirus. Meat Shield, Minion Life Ray Spectre. The Aurabot currently is using the Proximity Shield Spectres, which you can get from the Scepter of God and a few other places. Animate Guardian was something we were
messing with, but it ended up dying and we haven't bothered trying to resurrect it and put anything on it, so you can kind of just ignore this being here. Portal, just because why not? Molten Shell, this is for the exact same reason as the Duo Bot carry. You have a ton of armor, so Molten Shell gives you a ton of value. Vaal Discipline is in a Vinsect. Level 21 Vaal Discipline in a Vinsect. You don't really, if you're using this build for bossing, you really don't get Vaal Souls. You can just kind of make this a normal Discipline level 21. This doesn't need to be a Vaal Discipline level 21 because those are incredibly expensive. But yeah, this is in a Vinsect, which gives it +5 levels of socketed gems. It does give you reduced reservation efficiency, but you can compensate for that in other ways. And then if we go into the boots, which we can see are Syntrex, nothing special, no plus levels or anything like that. There is an Awakened Generosity. You can instead just use a Victario's Influence, which has a built-in level 30 Generosity. This is slightly worse than a level 5 20 quality Awakened Generosity, but it is still very similar in power for very cheap. The things in the Generosity are basically just Hatred and Clarity, because those are the only things that need to be applied to me that don't need to be applied to the Aurabot. Wrath and Anger do not do anything, because if we look at Wrath and Anger, which are the other two stereotypical, let's look at the Haste as well. These are the other typical offensive Aurabot auras. You see that Wrath applies more spell lightning damage and lightning damage with attacks, which, as we've talked about before, do not apply to secondary totem explosions, even if we did lightning damage with them. So Wrath, completely useless. Anger is the same idea. It only applies flat damage to attacks and spells. This does not apply to secondary damage and is therefore useless. Haste, while the movement speed is beneficial, that is the only thing it does for the Duo Aurabot with a Duo carry build, because attack and cast speed do not scale trap throwing speed, and it is effectively useless for damage reasons for this to be on the Aurabot, or to be on the Duo carry, so we don't run it either. And in the off weapon, which is the Matua, whatever you want to pronounce that as, you basically just run this for Cursor effect, if I remember correctly, and in this thing, it has no plus levels. You just have Defiant Spanner for defensiveness and Vitality, because it gives a ton of life regen combined with Zealot's Oath to sustain your health generally in fights. Yeah, that's just a general overview of the Aurabot. This is doing a very similar thing that I do in down here, which is doing a Elegant Hubris with an Impossible Escape to get a few nodes that aren't normally possible. It does this to get Ursora effect here. This build is slightly more optimal as a Scion Ascendant, but we did it as a Guardian because he already had a pre-level Templar, and honestly leveling in this game is a pain in the ass, so we didn't want to bother with that. And if it's everything else running CI, he's taking all of these nodes. Yeah, the tree should look very like a very general Aurabot tree. Anyone who's played an Aurabot should be familiar with the look of this absolutely horrendous tree. Hope you found this guide useful. And remember, find an Aurabot friend, or else you might end up like me, walking into packs and instantly dying to level 64 Act 10 maps because you have no defensives, no regen, no sustain. Your damage is still pretty good, but find yourself a friend if you want to play this build. Extremely powerful if you do.